Hello, I'm Karen Bass. I am a member of Congress and I represent California's 37th District, and I have the honor of serving as the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. I want to thank you for joining us today to discuss the new Amazon Studios documentary, All In, The Fight for Democracy. We're going to focus on the history of voter suppression in America and how we can all work together to overcome it. I will be joined by one of the producers of the film, the founder of Fair Fight Action, and one of the fiercest fighters against voter suppression I know, and my own personal shero, Stacey Abrams. But first, let's take a look at the trailer for the film.
If the power of the right to vote was truly made available to everyone in America, it would change the future of this nation.
Ladies and gentlemen, Stacey Abrams!
When I started running for governor, we anticipated that voter suppression was going to be instrumental in Brian Kemp's campaign, and we were right.
We've been in line for 5 hours.
They said, "You've already voted." Looks like several days ago. No, I would have remembered that.
Thousands of people were told no and didn't have the authority to demand better.
These lines are insane. We had precinct consolidation, non-training of local election officials.
I knew something had gone horribly wrong. The system that is supposed to protect our democracy didn't work the way it was supposed to.
States implement voter suppression laws all across the country.
Things like new voter ID laws, purging. You're knocked off the roll. Gerrymandering.
Changing the voting boundaries.
Ohio is a use it or lose it state.
In the United States, the right to vote is the only right you can lose simply for not using it.
Jim Crow 2.0, that's what we're saying. We've got a lot of work to do.
When we started as a country,
6% of people were eligible to vote. There's still forces that are determined to keep citizens from voting.
Unless we fight for the right to vote, our democracy is put at risk.
The fight over voting rights is ultimately about power.
The states have figured out how to stop African Americans, Hispanics, Asian Americans, the young, and the poor from voting.
history is never a straight line. It's always a fight.
I will not concede because the erosion of our democracy is not right.
We try to make history.
The vote matters.
You belong. You have value.
And now I have the pleasure of introducing Stacey Abrams, the founder of Fair Fight Action. Stacey is a New York Times best-selling author, serial entrepreneur, nonprofit CEO, and political leader. She's a former member and leader of the Georgia House of Representatives, the first Black woman nominated by a major party to run as governor for any state in the whole history of the United States. And I personally call her the governor of Georgia because we all know that election was stolen. Stacey is front and center, spotlighting voter suppression in All In. Stacey, this summer we lost a treasure and staunch champion for voting rights. My colleague and your fellow Georgian, the Honorable John Lewis. Congressman Lewis started his career as a student activist fighting for voting rights. 55 years after Bloody Sunday, do you think we're better off today than we were when John Lewis was a student activist marching for voter rights?
I do. First of all, I want to say thank you so much, Congresswoman Bass, Chairwoman Bass, for the leadership you've shown for so many years. I like to tell you every time I see you, as well as everyone else, that when you became Speaker of the House in California, that was a transformative moment in terms of knowing what is possible. And when you think about the work done by John Lewis, by you, by so many others, yes, we have made progress. But we have to remember that evil is persistent. Voter suppression began with the inception of our nation. It took the end of slavery. It took the 15th Amendment to give Black men the right to vote, the 19th Amendment to give white women the right to vote, the Voting Rights Act to give everyone else access to the right to vote, the 26th Amendment, which we often allied to give young people the right to vote. And through all of that, we know that we have been fighting against an original sin in our country, which was the exclusion of almost everyone from the democracy we said we wanted. And so when I think about the efforts led by John Lewis, when I think about his work as an activist, as a city council member, as a congressman, I know that we have made progress, but I know that our requirement that we keep fighting will not dissipate. It will not end, because even when we finally achieve the end of voter suppression, it will not be an end. It will be a pause, because voting is power. And as long as there are those who want others not to have that power, they will fight to take that power away. So we have to be fighting just as hard to access and expand that power to those who deserve it.
And Stacey, you know that one of the things I do in Congress is work in foreign affairs, and we run around the world preaching democracy and voting. And here we are still struggling for the right to vote. You know, I'm very excited about the film, and maybe you can tell us where we can see it. How can we view the film?
So All In, the Fight for Democracy, it premiered on September 9th in theaters, and it premiered on Amazon.com on September 18th. So you can watch it, stream it live on Amazon.
That's great. Well, in the film, we see old forms of voter suppression that work together systematically to exclude groups of people, Black people, people who couldn't read or write, poor people. So maybe you can compare the old school forms of voter suppression, like poll tax and literacy tests, to the new forms of voter suppression that we see today.
The architecture of voter suppression has remained pretty constant. It's, can you register and stay on the rolls? Can you cast a ballot, and does your ballot get counted? In the film, we talk about what used to happen. Can you register? No. For millions of Americans, it was illegal to register to vote. People were told they would lose. In fact, people lost their jobs. Fannie Lou Hamer was famously fired for having the audacity to try to get on the voting rolls. And so we know that historically being able to register was a challenge. Can you cast a ballot? Well, poll taxes and literacy tests were two of the ways they prevented us from being able to cast a ballot. Poll taxes, and I want people to understand this, it was a literal tax. And I know those of us who studied this history or lived this history, we understand it, but we're talking about people who would have to pay a week's wages or month's wages simply to have the right to vote. And there was a thing called the grandfather clause. And the grandfather clause said that if your grandfather was eligible to vote, then you're fine and you don't have to pay the tax, but everyone else does. Well, that only affected slaves and former slaves. It only affected Black people. White people, because their grandfathers were eligible to vote from the beginning, they were exempted from this tax. But poor people of color were almost exclusively denied access to the right to vote. Literacy tests were another way of saying you can't access the ballot. You couldn't register in some states and you couldn't vote in other states if you could not pass a literacy test. And let's be clear, the literacy test didn't end with the Voting Rights Act. It actually continued into the 1970s, promulgated in part by William Rehnquist, who went on to become the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. But in the 1970s, he was using literacy tests to block Latino and Native American voters from being able to cast a ballot. Fast forward to the 21st century, and we're at it again. Only this time you can't register because they changed the rules. In the state of Texas, until just recently, in the midst of COVID, you couldn't register online. We faced in Georgia for years something called exact match, where if there was any discrepancy in the bureaucratic transfer of your information, you could be denied the right to vote. And in 2018, 53,000 people were held hostage by the system, including 70% of them being African American and 80% of them being people of color. But we have things like strict voter ID laws. That's the new version of the how many bubbles in a bar of soap, because for some it's an impossibility to meet. If you're a student in Texas, in Georgia, In Wisconsin, you cannot use your student ID to cast a ballot. And then does your ballot get counted? Back in, before the advent of the Voting Rights Act, that often happened by having your ballots thrown out or being denied the right to fix a mistake that you didn't make. Today, we have provisional ballots, but what we're seeing is that too often poor communities and communities of color are given provisional ballots knowing that they can't come back and fix them instead of getting real ballots. Or we have absentee ballots to get thrown out. We know that you are 5 times more likely to have your absentee ballot tossed if you're a young person, and 2 times as likely to have them tossed out if you're Latino or Black. And so while the rules have changed and while the methods have changed, the basic architecture of voter suppression has remained stubbornly consistent from its inception to today.
Well, it just puts the pressure on us to make sure when we go to vote in November that we're going to need to vote in overwhelming numbers in anticipation of these tactics. So one thing that many people don't know, but they will learn in the documentary, is that the voter suppression tactic that Brian Kemp used to disenfranchise thousands of voters in your race was a tactic that the Obama administration had previously blocked Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Since we lost Section 5, there was no protection against this tactic in your race. Can you speak on the importance of restoring the Voting Rights Act, especially for states like Georgia?
Absolutely. So, and I'm going to tie it to something you just said about, what we need to do in November. Part of our insistence on the right to vote has to begin now. On September 4th, North Carolina began sending out absentee ballots. So we've got to shift our thinking from election being a single day to being a process, being a season that culminates in November. And one of the challenges to it being a season is that there are more attacks on how we can vote and how we even get access to the right to vote. And that's part of what happened in Georgia under Brian Kemp. In 2009, his predecessor, Karen Handel, attempted to use this system called exact match. She submitted it for pre-clearance, which is the requirement under the Voting Rights Act that the Justice Department look at a new system and they determine if it's going to harm the ability of protected communities to vote, namely communities of color. And they said this was a racially discriminatory system and they told her not to use it. Well, she leaves, runs for Congress. He gets appointed as the next Secretary of State and then gets elected in the following election. And as soon as the Voting Rights Act was gutted by the Supreme Court in Shelby versus Holder in 2013, Brian Kemp quietly reimposes this standard. And over the course of my time fighting with him, we discovered the first time there were more than 34,000 people we were able to identify. And by federal court order, he had to restore their right to vote. He then repeated the same system, getting new permission to do it from the state legislature. And this time they captured 53,000 people and held their registrations hostage. The problem with the evisceration of the Voting Rights Act is it didn't just affect Georgia, it affected every state that was held in check, that were prevented from using their power to hurt voters. Within hours of the evisceration of the Voting Rights Act, the state of Texas imposed the most strict voter ID law in the nation. Not within days, not within weeks, within hours. The Voting Rights Act was holding back voter discrimination and voter suppression, and they knew what they were doing when they ended it. They opened the floodgates, and now we see voter suppression sweeping our country.
Your race was a testament to the litany of suppressive efforts that some legislatures are willing to go to support and to neutralize the power of vote in communities of color. And you certainly just gave several examples. I remember in North Carolina, they said that was laser focused on blocking Black people from voting. So how can voters counteract the tactics that we saw in your gubernatorial race and also in some of the other states that you described? And maybe along with that, you can tell me, what are some of the worst offenders? Which states are some of the worst offenders?
So let's start with the first job is to know what they're doing. Evil thrives in the dark. Bad behavior does best when it's in the shadows, when no one can point it out and no one can be held accountable. And so our first responsibility is to make sure people understand what voter suppression looks like. That's the impetus for All In. I know what voter suppression looks like. But the reason I wanted to make this film, the reason I'm so proud of the work done by Liz Garbus and Lisa Cortez, our directors, was because we needed to understand what it looks like, what it feels like, how it has, what the effect it has, because you can't fight an enemy you don't see and you don't understand. And so our first job is to know what it is. And for those who want an even deeper dive, I wrote a book about it called Our Time Is Now, because it really does matter. But the second part is, once you know the enemy, know what your rights are. And that's another part of what we're doing with this film. At the end, we give you all of these resources. We want people to know you've got the tools to dismantle voter suppression. The most effective tool, of course, is electing people who actually believe in your right to vote. But short of that, it's knowing to check your registration, knowing what the rules are for being able to take you off of the rolls, what we call purging. It's knowing whether you live in a state that requires restrictive voter ID and how you meet that. Knowing if you get to use all of the tools for voting, in-person early voting, and vote by mail, or if you're in one of the 9 or 10 states that still require that you can only show up on election day. But it's getting the system down and knowing what happens where you live. And then it's demanding that our leaders do better, that we have better laws and better rules. The states that are the worst, the states that are the most egregious, are not hard to figure out. Right now, and let's be clear, I'm going to take a step back and say it this way. Almost every political party that's ever held real power has used voter suppression. Jim Crow was the province of Democrats in the South. The Whigs were the first party, and they used voter suppression themselves. So let's be clear, voter suppression has been practiced by any political party with power, trying to hold that power, not by adapting to their people, but by keeping people out of power. And in the 21st century, sadly, that is the Republican Party. And so part of the challenge with identifying the worst states is that you can usually start with whether they're run by Democrats or Republicans. And we know that right now, the most egregious states are Georgia, Florida, Texas. We know Arizona has a great Secretary of State, but she's constantly in a battle to make them do right because she has a Republican-led legislature and a Republican governor. We know that Wisconsin is doing its best, that Tony Evers, the governor, was trying to get good done. And he was sued by the state legislature, the Republican state legislature, to force Wisconsinites to go and vote in person because they didn't want too many people to vote. We know that in Michigan, we've got a great Secretary of State and a great governor working to expand access to the right to vote. And there's still folks in that state trying to make it harder. And so those are the states to look at. But what's most important is knowing what the rules are where you live. And so if you go to vote.org, or more importantly, if you go to allinforvoting.org, we can tell you, allinforvoting.org, we can tell you what the rules are where you live, so you know whether you live in a state that's trying to do good or a state that's holding on to bad, hoping you'll give up and go away.
So with all of that, how do we keep Black voters in parts of the country, those states that you named, or in Georgia, how do we keep them motivated and confident in the election process?
I look at voter suppression as an opportunity to galvanize action.
Yeah.
And you know this, for years we were told, don't talk about it, don't mention voter suppression, you're going to scare people. Well, the problem is people know they've been hurt.
Right.
When you hear people say, well, my vote doesn't matter, when you hear them say it's too hard, that's their expression of voter suppression. They didn't know to call it that, but that's what they were dealing with. When people are convinced that it's not worth the effort because it's too hard, and other people say, oh, it's a breeze for me, that discrepancy is the example that tells you there's a problem. And so we had to first take the step of declaring that voter suppression is real. I did that in my campaign. When I gave my non-concession speech, I acknowledged the legal sufficiency of the outcome of the election, but I called out the rules that made it possible. And that's the first step. If we don't declare this to be wrong, if we don't acknowledge that it is subtle, it's not billy clubs and hoses, it's administrative rules and barriers. If we don't call it out, people won't know that it's not them, it is you. It's not you, it is them. That it's not a bug in the system, it's a feature of the system. But then the second part is giving them the tools to know what they should demand. And that's a big part of the work I'm so proud that you do through the Congressional Black Caucus and through the CBC Foundation, It's reaching out to communities and helping them understand what their rights are. Because of you, I've had a chance to meet with the Tri-Caucuses, with the Hispanic Caucus and the API Caucus, with Deb Holland and Sharice Davids, who represent Native Americans. And because of your leadership, we've been able to have this great conversation where we're no longer terrified by voter suppression. We're angered by it. And when you're angry, you'll fight back. And that's really the mission. There is no accident that the title of this film is all in the fight for democracy, because democracy is not given. It's not something that just exists. We have to fight every day to take it back. To your point earlier, you've got to take it back from autocrats, from populist authoritarians who believe they should be able to aggregate power to themselves. You've got to take it back from those who think democracy should only work for a few people. Our responsibility is to be angry about anyone who would destroy our system of values and our system of voting, and do our best to make sure that everyone who is eligible can cast their ballots.
Well, that is one thing about Black folks. If you make them mad and tell them they can't vote. I remember in Obama's reelection and being in Ohio before Election Day, and I was freezing to death because I'm a LA girl, and was trying to inspire people to stay in line. And people looked at me like, we got this. We know what's going on. We're not going to fall for this at all. Well, as you mentioned the film, tell me a little bit about where the idea for the film came from, and why did you want to be a part of it?
In the wake of my election, I had been interviewed for a few different documentaries that did really good jobs. We had the Ava DuVernay executive produced She Could Be Next. There was Rigged, there was Suppressed. So there were these documentaries that either tracked the different campaigns or talked about voter suppression specific to Georgia. But I was having a conversation with a young woman who had been instrumental in my campaign, and she actually questioned the comparison of what was happening in Florida with the restoration of rights for returning citizens, the decision by the governor and the legislature to impose fees and fines as a precondition of getting back this right that they never should have lost in the first place. She said, well, why do people call it a poll tax? No one knows what that means. You should come up with a more interesting way to describe it. And it hit me that she, despite being embedded in my work, doing this with me day by day, being one of the most amazing canvassers and organizers I've ever known, she was 26. She had no idea what a poll tax was. And for those of us who either grew up in the civil rights movement or were raised by those in the civil rights movement, it's been emblazoned in our memories what these things are. But there's a whole generation and entire communities that have never really been steeped in this knowledge. And so it was for me an important story, not to tell the story of my campaign. I was there, I remember it, but to tell the history of voter suppression and what it means today based on what it was. And so I actually reached out to, through the team I worked with in LA, we reached out to a few different producers. I met Liz Garbus and Dan Kogan, and Liz had been thinking about this too. And so we collaborated and really had conversations about how would you tell the story. We were both very clear that we wanted it to be bigger than me. In fact, I didn't want me to be in it, but they convinced me I had to say something. But the goal was to talk about it not just as a Black issue, although it has always been centered around Blackness and our legitimacy as citizens, and I don't ever want to undercut that. But we have to remember Native Americans didn't become citizens of this country until 1924, and their right to vote didn't truly become real until the 1960s. That Latinos and the Asian American populations also face voter suppression, because anytime you are a burgeoning population with the ability to upset the apple cart, they're going to try to stop you. I wanted us to talk about that whole universe, but also to talk about the fact that there are Republicans who face voter suppression. In New Hampshire, they've passed laws to block students from voting, and that's not exactly a bastion of liberalism. And we know that there are multiple communities that face it, and we have to understand its entire spectrum. And so, Liz came on board, they brought Lisa on board, she was amazing, and the film came together incredibly quickly. I'm just privileged that I get to be a part of the storytelling. It didn't need to be a retrospective on what happened to me, but I think my campaign is emblematic of what the challenge of voter suppression what it would suggest for the rest of the country.
Well, when you talk about people who are not aware of it, it reminds me of the policing issue. So much of America is surprised about what goes on with police, and some think it's a relatively new issue, just as people are having growing awareness of voter suppression and not realizing that both of these issues are as old as the country, basically. And so, there's a lot of concern about very specific dirty tricks that might happen in this election. And so what do you think people need to be prepared for? What type of dirty tricks are you anticipating?
So number one, we're watching more than $20 million is being spent by the Trump campaign and the Republican National Committee and associated groups to restrict access to the right to vote. And let's be clear. We're not talking about whether or not you're eligible to vote. These are tactics that are aimed at people who are eligible to vote. They just don't want them to be able to. And they've said it. The goal is to constrict who's able to vote. They use this lie that voter fraud is the worry. But if you use the most conservative estimates by the most conservative organization, the Heritage Foundation, they can come up with only 1,300 potential cases of voter suppression over 20 years and 625 million votes.
Voter fraud.
Voter fraud.
Voter fraud.
It's not real. And even the examples they try to use, typically we only know about it because people got caught because it's hard to do it. And so we have to understand that voter fraud isn't real, but they're going to try to scare you into believing it is real. And so it's not enough to say it's not real. We've got to use the numbers. 1,300 cases out of 625 million votes.
Jeez.
Those are lottery odds, okay?
What I remember in the last couple of elections, there were some pretty infamous cases of voter fraud, but they involved Republicans. I remember the case in North Carolina where the man's son essentially testified against him and talked about how he was stealing the ballots from Black people. And so, go ahead.
Oh, no, please.
So voter fraud is something that is used, but, over the last couple of days, the president has been encouraging people to actually commit voter fraud.
Exactly.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, so if we stay with voter fraud, the North Carolina case is a perfect example because when you dig down, it wasn't voters who were trying to steal votes.
Right.
It was a professional attempt to steal the votes. So even in that case, it was election fraud. We don't have a overvoting problem in the United States. We don't have too many people trying to show up. That's not our issue.
Right.
And so part of the dirty tricks, it's making sure people understand what is real and what's not real. Voter fraud is, for all intents and purposes, not something that you need to be concerned about, unless the president of the United States tells you to go and commit voter fraud by mailing in your ballot and then voting in person. That is illegal. That is a felony in North Carolina. And the reason I don't just dismiss it out of hand is that somebody who is afraid, namely some African American who hasn't voted before, tries to vote by mail, can't find out if their ballot got turned in, they show up to vote in person, and they say, well, the president told me I could do it. We don't know if they're going to get arrested, and the judge who decides to handle their case says, well, you didn't do it on purpose, you just were listening to what the president said, or they get held accountable for believing something that they couldn't know was a lie. And so we can't just ignore the misinformation coming from the president and say, well, it's just more of his chaos. He could get people into real trouble. And that's another one of the dirty tricks. A third one that's out there very quickly is that they are planning to pull together 50,000 people as poll observers. This matters because in 1981 in New Jersey, the Republican National Committee hired off-duty officers to wear armbands and sidearms and walkie-talkies, and they put up signs saying you are being monitored. And they put it in Black and brown precincts in New Jersey. It was so egregious that the federal government imposed a consent decree that lasted for 35 years. Shockingly, it got lifted in 2017 under the Trump administration. But here's why it matters. We know that we have a whole new cohort of voters, namely communities of color, a lot of newly naturalized citizens, a lot of young people. And if they have 50,000 people out there trying to scare you out of voting, it may not work on you, but it works on the person in front of you and the person back in line who hears someone say, if you vote, we can come after you. If you vote, we can hold you, we can arrest you. We'll issue a warrant. And if that works, then you will have voter intimidation, the likes of which we haven't seen in decades. And so we need people to be vigilant, but not be afraid, because the right to vote is yours. The power is yours.
Well, you know, I don't know if you are aware of this, but there was an African-American woman, I believe she was in Texas, who made a mistake in voting. And if I remember the story correctly, didn't she go to prison?
She went to prison.
And I think she was sentenced to like 5 years.
Yes.
And it wasn't like she was double voting or anything. I don't remember what her mistake was, but
she hadn't, so there are two cases, one where a woman had a green card and didn't know she couldn't vote, and someone else who was following the rules from the state she lived in before, I think was the issue. And that goes to the challenge of our decentralized approach to voting. We don't have one set of standardized rules that you memorize in 8th grade and you just use them. Every state has different rules, which means every state is an opportunity to make a mistake. And the question is, do we want to treat citizens as though we are suspicious of them or encouraging of them? Mm-hmm. And I would love to, actually, I'm going to take the prerogative of being the one talking and ask you to talk about the first time you really understood the scope of voter suppression.
Well, it was as a child, watching it in the civil rights movement and watching the news and watching people get beat up and be threatened and hearing about people who were killed. So that I grew up knowing that, but I grew up knowing that about the South. I grew up in California, but I will tell you that it wasn't that long ago, about an hour south of Los Angeles is Orange County, which up until 2018 was solid Republican county. Now, of course, we turned it blue. But what they did there, as the Latino population grew and as anti-immigrant sentiment in our state grew, they posted police officers there. The same thing that you said, off-duty police officers. And really, that was within the last 20 years. It wasn't that long ago. And basically, they did that to scare Latinos for thinking that if they made a mistake, they might wind up being deported. And so I definitely remember that. And just think that the idea that Trump, I mean, you know, we saw him do this in the peaceful protests, dispatch these armed bodies of men. We didn't even know who they were. They didn't even have signage on them. And I can imagine something like that happening. And then I bet it would just happen to be in the swing states. I bet that's where it might be. So it just seems like there's so many different ways and areas that we have to be vigilant about in this election.
Well, one way to be vigilant is to make a plan to vote early. If you vote by mail, you can avoid most of the tactics they're planning to use. And the earlier you vote by mail, the more assurance you have that your vote's going to count. And so that's what we tell people. First and foremost, if you can vote by mail, do so. If you don't know, go to allinforvoting.com, look up your state, and you'll know what the rules are, but plan to vote by mail. If voting by mail doesn't work, then you roll to the next option, which is voting in person early. 40 states allow you to vote in person early. 41 states allow you to vote by mail with no excuse. And so if vote by mail doesn't work, something goes horribly wrong, vote in person early. If that fails, then your last resort is voting in person on election day. And even then, just make sure you have a plan. Make sure you've got your PPE, make sure you've made a plan, you know where your polling place is, check it the day before, check it the day of, because you don't want to wait in line for 3 hours only to find out you were in the wrong line the whole time. And so part of the way to push back, to be vigilant, is to know your plan and to make sure everyone you know has a plan. Mm-hmm. We have to see this as a joint effort. If we're going to fight, we can't fight this alone. You said at the very beginning, we've got to overwhelm them with our presence. And that means having a plan to vote, but it's also about knowing that if we don't know the answer on November 3rd by 11 p.m., that doesn't mean we've lost. It doesn't mean we've won. It means we don't know. And if we're doing this right, we shouldn't know, because we're going to have millions of people who cast their ballots by mail, more than we have ever had in American history. And it's going to be slow. It's going to be delayed. We're going to have a lot of folks who get their ballot postmarked on election day, and they've got 3 to 4 days. In California, I think you guys have 17 days to get the mail in. And so we need to not panic if we don't have an answer. And we need to not believe anybody who declares they know something before we all know it. So if Donald Trump decides to declare himself the emperor of all that is new, it's not real. But at the same token, no matter who it is, nobody can declare themselves the victor until we have all the information. Anything other than that is a lie.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I have to tell you that we all witnessed you become the nation's first Black woman to become a gubernatorial nominee. And we saw your national profile raise so much over the last few years, and you were on the list for consideration for vice president. I have to tell you that one of the things that I admire so much about you, and I've told you this before, is that after the election was stolen from you, you decided to create these organizations and get busy. And what you have done in regarding the census and also elections, I mean, you have left an infrastructure in place that will help us for years to come and leave many to replicate. So I just have to say, what's next? What's next for Stacey Abrams?
Well, look, first we got to get through. I'm gonna actually pick up on one piece you mentioned, and I'll tell you what's next. But the census, I'd love for us to have a quick conversation about the census. All In is going to be, out in mid-September. It comes out September 9th. It's going to be streaming on September the 18th. But the census, unfortunately, is scheduled to end the data collection on September 30th. You and I know that if you have the right to vote, but you don't have the resources that come with being an American, and worse, you don't get to pick your leaders because they've stolen your rights by drawing you into communities that don't reflect your needs and your values, having the right to vote can sometimes feel empty. And so I've been so privileged to work with you. You've been an extraordinary partner on fighting voter suppression and on pushing the census and promoting participation. We know that the census right now is not counting communities of color, especially Black folks. We are being deeply undercounted. The only community with the worst participation, with an undercount that is harsher than ours, is the Native American community. And that means right now, we've got millions of Black folks who are not going to get access to the monies they need for COVID recovery, and they may lose congressional power if they are not seen. And so I just want to take a moment to say thank you to you for your leadership on the census, but also to remind everyone, please fill out your census. Do not worry about them using it. It's not an invasion of privacy. If you have a cell phone or utility bill, they can already find you. Fill out the census so you can get your money and your political power. And I didn't know if you wanted to say anything else about the census, since that's part of the work that you've been so exceptional about getting done.
Well, on behalf of the Congressional Black Caucus, and really through your efforts, because you have heightened our awareness significantly about the census. But I remember when we talked recently and we did that opinion piece together a month or so ago, and you talked about them wanting to have the data reported early, and we want the data reported a little later. And maybe you could explain that, because that is a technicality that we need to be very, very, very clear about. A last dirty trick that he could pull, what I hope will be on his way out of office. I hope he doesn't pull it, but that is something that we have to be concerned about.
So the way the census works is that every 10 years we gather data about who's here. And it's not about citizens, it's not about adults or children, it's everyone in America, because you need to know who's here to know what we need. We then divvy up $1.5 trillion every year based on that count. But the count isn't just numbers, it's data about each community. So it's the number of people who are Latino or Black or Asian or white. It's whether you live in a rural community or an urban community or suburban community. It's the ages that it's how old you are and what you need. And the reason those pieces of information are so important is made more perfectly clear because of COVID. We know that communities of color, that namely Black and Latino communities, as well as Native Americans, are much more likely to be affected by COVID disproportionately, which means more resources are going to be necessary to help those communities recover. But we also know that none of those communities live in isolation from anyone else. And so if you live in a state that has a high COVID number, you need every dollar that can come to your state to show up. Well, if the numbers are wrong, if they end the census early and they don't count everyone, that's like your boss not counting all the hours you worked, deciding to stop counting your hours, not when you punch out, but when he decided, yeah, he's done. And then that means you don't get the balance of your paycheck. Even worse, it can mean that when he reports you to his boss, he can say you didn't do your part. And the problem is, if that happens, if we not only lose our numbers, but we are underrepresented, we never get the resources we're entitled to. And if they report it early and they report it without checking their work, once it's written down, once that final boss has stamped it, that's the rule. There is no appealing it. There's no asking for permission. There's no trying to go back and change it. And so the problem with reporting the data early is that we know we don't have the data right. The Census Bureau has said they have serious errors in what they're doing, and they have serious concerns that this can be done accurately. And the problem is we've got to live with the mistakes made for 10 years. So you want as few mistakes as possible. That's why we've got to complete the census. That's also why we have to demand that our leaders take action to ensure that they don't deliver the census data until it's right. And that means not trying to do something that takes 6 months and trying to get it done in 3 months.
You know, you said early on that the history of voter suppression in the United States is as old as the country. And you also said that the reason for it is because people want to hold on to power. Those that are in power want to stay there. And I've often thought that there are people in our country that see the writing on the wall, which is in a few decades, the majority of people in the United States will be people of color. And I think that they're a bit panicked by that. And I think that that has led to a lot of things, aside from the manipulation of the census and voter suppression. I also believe it's one of the fundamental reasons why Mitch McConnell is so dead set on confirming judges, and he looks for judges that are in their 40s. So if we do pass good laws, they can just take them to court. So all in, the fight is all in all the time. And I will look forward to seeing the film and telling everybody to watch it and to continue to keep their eyes on Stacey Abrams. You were going to say something else.
No, I was going to say this. I have been focused on making sure that we have a free and fair election. I am focused on making sure we have an accurate census. Being in the South, I've been focused on an organization I created called the Southern Economic Advancement Project. And we're doing something called South Strong so that we can make sure that the 12 Southern states get their fair share of COVID recovery and that we don't come out of this worse than we were before, but stronger and better than ever. But more than anything, I've just remained committed to justice. You and I have talked about this before. You run for office for different reasons.
Right.
And I've run for offices and I've decided not to run for offices. My mission is to always find the job I can do to get the work done. And not every title and every position lets you do the same work. And sometimes it can be counterproductive. And so for me, it's always been about making sure I'm looking not at the title, not at the salary, not at the prestige, but looking at what can be accomplished. Because what drives me is a belief that we deserve justice, that poverty is immoral and solvable, and that everyone deserves opportunity. And while I stand on the side of blue, while I'm a Democrat, I believe that this is about being an American. It's about being a human, and that we are all committed to this. All in is about making sure that regardless of which side of the aisle you stand on, you always stand with democracy. And while the CBC is an you all have been the monitors and the protectors of our democracy for so many years. You were born of what became the civil rights movement, and you have been the stewards of making it possible that we can keep this fight going. My future is going to be revealed to me, I think probably a few minutes before everybody else finds out about it. But my point is that I will always be looking for the work I can do to make sure that everyone has real access to opportunity. And it will always be my honor to do that in partnership with the great Karen Bass.
Well, everything you said just sums up as to why I consider you a shero. I listened to all of the organizations you've created, and that's why you're a serial entrepreneur. But those organizations are always rooted in the fight for social and economic justice. And I am honored to be your friend and to fight alongside of you. This fight is a long-term fight, and I'll be there right with you. Thank you so much for giving me the honor to participate with you today.
Thank you so much.